Natalie Rivers, 30 years old, a death row inmate awaiting execution in the state of Texas. She had been sentenced for murdering her boyfriend in a violent, jealous rage, a case that had once shocked the media, not just for its brutality, but because she was so beautiful. But that wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to her. Never, because 3 years later, after she had spent every day alone in a solitary death row cell in a place under 24/7 surveillance, with no physical contact, no outside visitors, and no man ever allowed inside, something completely unimaginable happened. She turned up pregnant. Unbelievable, right? A female death row inmate, kept in isolation, no one allowed near her, no chance of physical contact, and yet, somehow, she was pregnant. It was discovered during a routine medical checkup. At first, the nurse thought it was a mistake. She ran the test again. Positive. The chief physician came in. Blood work confirmed it. Natalie was 8 weeks pregnant. The prison system nearly stopped in its tracks. No one could understand. No one could explain it. There were no gaps in the schedule. Every hallway had keycard access. Every cell had its own security camera streaming live to the central control room. Every minute, every movement, every procedure, recorded and logged. Natalie was taken to a private room for questioning, but she insisted she had no idea what had happened. She looked confused, distant, almost drugged, her voice barely audible. She murmured, "Every night, I dream that someone's touching me." That sentence sent a chill through the room. But then, 3 days later, she was dead. Suddenly, without warning, no injuries, no signs of struggle, no sound in the night. At 6:12 in the morning, during routine head count, a female officer stopped in front of cell 32. Natalie was lying motionless on the floor, curled up, lips bluish, eyes shut. No breath, no pulse. No blood, no foreign objects, no indication of a fight. The prison doctor declared the cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest, likely due to psychological shock combined with prolonged depression. Because she was on death row and the prison wanted to avoid bad press, all procedures were handled quickly and quietly. The autopsy, like everything else, was rushed. Before she became inmate number 92415, Natalie Rivers was the kind of woman people couldn't stop looking at. Strikingly beautiful, thick, dark hair, eyes the color of forest glass. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. When she walked into a room, silence followed her like gravity. But beauty couldn't save her. Not after what she did. Her boyfriend, Daniel Keene, was found stabbed 34 times in their apartment just outside Houston. Prosecutors said it was a crime of jealousy, obsession, possession. The jury didn't take long. The sentence was death. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Natalie had been living in the solitary wing of St. Eloria State Prison, the black cell, as some guards called it, windowless, concrete walls, a single bed bolted to the floor, no TV, no books without permission. 1 hour of recreation per day in a cage the size of a walk-in closet. The prison itself was a machine, cold, efficient, designed for containment, not comfort. Everything ran on routine. Wake up at 6:00 a.m., lights on, tray through the door, medical checks once a week, mental health evaluations once a month, no visits unless authorized by the warden. And for the women on death row, especially those like Natalie, housed in total isolation, life became less about time and more about waiting. Natalie rarely spoke to anyone. She declined group therapy, refused chaplain visits, never caused trouble, but never asked for anything, either. The only person she interacted with on a regular basis was her doctor. Dr. Warren Hale, 53 years old, calm, soft-spoken, the kind of man whose presence made people lower their voice. He was the prison's lead psychiatrist and Natalie's sole mental health provider. On paper, his job was to monitor her psychological state, manage her treatment for clinical depression, and evaluate her risk level every 90 days. But somewhere along the line, something went wrong. Dr. Hale had started Natalie on a custom sedative blend 6 months into her sentence, a nightly dose, taken orally to help her sleep. It was approved, monitored, logged, but no one ever tested the actual contents of the medication. Why would they? The prescriptions were issued by the prison's own pharmacy. The bottles were sealed, the labels clean. And Hale, he had never once been written up, not in 22 years. But he wasn't the only one with access. There was also Officer Caleb Dorsey, 46, night shift supervisor, responsible for rounds in the death row wing between midnight and 600 a.m. He had a military background, a permanent scowl, and a reputation for being strict, but reliable. Too reliable. He never took sick days, never requested transfers, always signed up for extra hours, especially in the solitary unit. Most guards hated that wing. Too quiet, too eerie, but not Dorsey. He preferred it. Said the piece helped him think. He was the only person, other than Dr. Hale, who entered Natalie's section during those final months. And no one was watching him. Because in St. Eloria, everyone assumed the system worked. Cameras were always running, doors were always locked, protocols were always followed. Except they weren't. Not always. And not at night. There were rumors, of course. Other inmates had complained of weird noises coming from the isolation block. One said she heard a woman crying in the middle of the night, not just crying, begging, but guards brushed it off as hallucinations, or just inmates looking for attention. Natalie never reported anything. Maybe because she didn't know what was happening to her. Or maybe because she knew no one would believe her. After all, who would listen to a convicted murderer? But something was changing in the last few weeks before her death. A few staff members noticed she had lost weight. She looked more tired than usual. Her eyes seemed unfocused. One day, she fell asleep during a routine medical check, something that had never happened before. When asked if she was okay, she just nodded slowly. "It's just the meds," she said. "They make my dreams weird." Weird. She didn't explain, and no one followed up. Because in St. Eloria, questions made people uncomfortable, and discomfort led to paperwork, so most people looked away. Until that pregnancy test. Until that sentence. Every night, I dream that someone's touching me. Until that body on the floor. Cold, quiet, gone. And now, the cracks in the system were too big to ignore. Because something was hiding in the silence. And it had Natalie's name all over it. Natalie Rivers was dead. That much was certain. Her body had been found at exactly 6:12 in the morning by Officer Kelly Monroe, a 39-year-old corrections officer with 10 years of experience at St. Eloria. She had walked her usual path, checked the doors as always, and when she looked into cell 32, something immediately felt off. Natalie wasn't on her bed. She wasn't standing. She wasn't pacing like she often did. She was lying on the floor, completely still, on her side, one hand curled under her chest, the other stretched across the concrete as if reaching for something in her sleep. Monroe called for backup. Within minutes, a medical team arrived, but it was already too late. Natalie's body was cold, her lips had turned blue, her pupils were unresponsive. There were no marks on her neck, no visible bruises, no puncture wounds, no vomit, no foam, no blood. She was simply gone. The prison's lead physician, Dr. Warren Hale, pronounced her dead at the scene, the official cause cardiac arrest sudden, likely triggered by emotional stress. The report noted that Natalie had been diagnosed with severe depression and had recently experienced a major psychological event, the discovery of her pregnancy. From the administration's perspective, it all added up. She had snapped. Her mind, already fragile, had collapsed under the weight of what she was carrying, literally and emotionally, a tragic but natural death. And so, because she was a death row inmate, and because the prison wanted to avoid headlines, everything moved fast, too fast. The body was transferred to the infirmary within the hour. A basic autopsy was performed just enough to meet the legal requirements. No toxicology, no neurological scans, no tissue samples stored for later analysis. Just a quick internal examination, a few notes, a signature, and a zippered bag. It was over in less than 4 hours. The report was filed away. Natalie Rivers was officially declared dead. Case closed. But not for everyone. In the basement level of St. Eloria, behind a heavy gray door marked Data Systems, a junior technician named Eric Klein was doing his job. Eric wasn't high-ranking. He wasn't part of administration. He didn't wear a badge or carry a weapon. What he did carry was a key card that gave him access to the prison's surveillance server, and that made all the difference. Eric had only been at St. Eloria for 7 months, a college graduate with a degree in information systems. He took the job because it paid well and offered state benefits. Most days, he worked quietly in the background, transferring data, maintaining backups, and filing timestamps. No one ever really talked to him. Which meant no one was watching when he discovered something strange. That Monday, Eric had been tasked with archiving the previous week's surveillance data from the death row wing. It was routine, boring, even. He scrolled through the feed logs, organized the digital files by cell number, and prepared to send everything into long-term storage. Then he saw it. A blank entry? The camera for cell 32. Natalie's cell had gone offline for exactly 73 minutes during the early hours of Sunday night. No explanation, no malfunction report, no weather issues, just a clean, unexplained blackout between 1:04 a.m. and 2:17 a.m. Eric frowned. He checked the system diagnostics. Nothing was flagged. The server was running smoothly. The rest of the cameras were fine. So why was that one missing? He ran a query to pull historical data on the same camera over the past month. The results chilled him. 14 outages, all between 1:00 a.m. and 3:00 a.m., all ranging between 40 to 80 minutes, all in the last 8 weeks. All in cell 32. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. Cameras weren't supposed to go dark in the solitary wing. Not for a second, not without an immediate work order and documentation. Every glitch, every reboot, every technical hiccup, it was all supposed to be recorded. But these blackouts, they weren't recorded at all. No. It was as if someone had manually disabled the camera and done so very carefully. Eric opened a second log, the access control database that recorded staff movement and system usage. He cross-referenced the blackout windows with employee logins and badge swipes. One name kept showing up. Officer Caleb Dorsey. His access badge had been used to enter the hallway outside cell 32 on every single night the feed went down. Sometimes 10 minutes before the camera cut, sometimes right after, but always during the same time frame, always between 1 and 3 in the morning. Eric's mouth went dry. He dug deeper. 3 days after Natalie's death, just 2 days before Eric was scheduled to archive the footage, Dorsey had logged into the maintenance console for the surveillance system, not from the IT room, from a guard station near the infirmary, for 12 minutes. That shouldn't have been possible. The credentials used were administrator level, not available to correctional staff. Only IT and high-ranking supervisors had access to that command level. How did Dorsey get in? Eric sat frozen for several minutes. He had stumbled onto something, and whatever it wasn't a coincidence. Natalie was pregnant. Natalie was dead. And now the only camera in her cell had been repeatedly disabled by a man with no business accessing the system. Mama and Zessen. Eric knew what the right thing was. He packaged the log entries, saved the video timeline, and submitted a formal anomaly report to his immediate supervisor. The next morning, his inbox was empty. No reply. No follow-up. No acknowledgement whatsoever. The report had disappeared, just like the footage. That night, Eric made a personal backup of everything. He copied the server logs, the badge access data, the list of blackouts, and the entire timeline into a secure folder. Then he sent it anonymously to an old classmate who now worked as a crime reporter for a regional news outlet. 48 hours later, the headlines exploded. Pregnant death row inmate found dead camera feed missing during night shift. The article detailed the gaps in surveillance, the security breaches, the lack of autopsy procedures, and the suspicious timing of a corrections officer's access. Public outrage followed. And with it, pressure. Because now, the outside world wanted answers. And the prison's silence was no longer an option. When the name Caleb Dorsey first appeared in the security logs, it didn't raise many eyebrows. He had worked the night shift at St. Eloria for over 9 years, always punctual, rarely took days off, never caused problems. On paper, he was a model employee, the kind of guy the warden didn't have to worry about. But on closer inspection, that dependability began to look unnatural. He never requested time off, never switched shifts, never called in sick. He volunteered for holidays, weekends, and every overnight slot in the solitary wing. He preferred working alone, said it was quieter that way. Most guards avoided the death row corridor. Too isolated, too creepy, too much paperwork if something went wrong. But Dorsey, he liked it. He said the inmates respected silence. He didn't need backup, didn't like babysitting rookies. And since no one ever caused trouble in solitary, no one pushed back. For years, no one questioned him. Until now. After the media leaked the surveillance outages and pointed fingers at Dorsey, Internal Affairs was forced to act. A review of his personnel file revealed some troubling patterns. He had been involved in 2 prior misconduct complaints, both from female inmates, one in 2018, the other in 2020. Both were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. In both cases, the inmates alleged inappropriate behavior during the night shift. Nothing violent, nothing physical, just strange. One said she woke up and felt like someone had been in her cell. Another said she thought she saw Dorsey standing just outside her window at 3:00 a.m., but no one believed her. There was no video to prove it, and Dorsey denied it. Now, that suddenly didn't seem so easy to dismiss. Investigators began combing through access logs not just for Natalie's cell, but for the entire death row wing. What they found was alarming. Over a period of 6 months, Dorsey had accessed secured zones outside of his assigned patrol path more than 40 times. Each time, during hours when no supervisors were present. Each time, without radioing for clearance. Each time, unreported. And then there was the maintenance console login, the one that used admin-level credentials to access the camera system. Oh, no. That entry couldn't be ignored. The prison's IT team was brought in to audit the server. What they discovered confirmed Eric Klein's worst fears. The surveillance feed for Cell 32 had been manually disabled, not through failure or malfunction, but through direct user intervention. The logs had been wiped, or at least someone tried to wipe them, but the backup still carried the digital fingerprints. And those fingerprints led straight to Dorsey. But he wasn't the only one. Another login had occurred during the same window, not into the camera system, but into Natalie's medical file. The account. It was a medical login registered to Dr. Warren Hale. According to the logs, He had accessed Natalie's psychiatric records 3 times between April and May. 2 of those sessions occurred at 2 in the morning, well outside of his working hours. Why would the prison doctor be reviewing an inmate's mental health profile in the middle of the night? The answer came when investigators pulled Hale's prescription records. Natalie had been prescribed a sedative called soprolane, a non-addictive sleep aid typically used to manage high-anxiety inmates. The dosage was standard, the schedule consistent. But 5 weeks before her pregnancy was discovered, the dosage had changed. Hale had added a second compound to the mix, a medication labeled as sleep regulation support. It wasn't flagged, it wasn't technically illegal, but no one else on staff had signed off on it. There was no secondary physician's review, no pharmacy confirmation. And the new compound, it had a known sedative interaction, capable of rendering someone completely unconscious at high doses. Natalie had been ingesting it every night, unaware. When the report was made public, the prison responded with carefully chosen words, "We are reviewing protocols and cooperating fully with investigators." But the damage was done. 2 men, one with access to the inmate, one with control over her medication, and both caught tampering with systems they weren't supposed to touch. Suddenly, the picture was becoming clear. Caleb Dorsey disabled the cameras. Warren Hale drugged the inmate. And Natalie Rivers, trapped between the two, had no idea what was being done to her. The night shift had become their playground. And no one had been watching. Until now. As public pressure mounted, the Department of Corrections had no choice but to authorize a second independent medical review of Natalie Rivers' death. This time, the autopsy wasn't rushed, it wasn't handled in-house, and it wasn't ignored. The body had already been embalmed, but there were still enough preserved tissue samples to run a comprehensive toxicology panel. What came back stunned everyone. In addition to the standard traces of soprolene, the prescribed sedative, there was another compound present, one that should have never been inside a correctional facility, one that had no place in any psychiatric treatment plan. Digitalis, a cardiac glycoside derived from the foxglove plant. In low doses, it can regulate heart rate. In higher concentrations, it becomes a deadly poison, one that causes the heart to slow, then seize, then stop. Symptoms mimic sudden cardiac arrest, quiet, painless, virtually untraceable unless specifically tested for. And now it was in Natalie Rivers' blood. But how? Investigators pulled every bottle, ampule, and record from the prison pharmacy. They found nothing unusual until they examined the handwritten logs kept by Dr. Warren Hale. He had made personal notes about Natalie's treatment, not typed, not digital, written in longhand on an old spiral-bound pad, sloppy, cryptic, but one line stood out. It was dated 6 days before Natalie's death. Increase evening compound tolerance rising. Add cardiac support to balance dose. Cardiac support. They checked the label of the ampules Natalie had been given that week. The pharmacy's barcode showed a standard sleep blend, but the chemical analysis told another story. The contents included a microdose of digitalis. Someone had switched the labels. And there were only 2 people who had access to both the medical storage and Natalie's treatment schedule: the prison pharmacist who had denied any unauthorized mixing, and Dr. Hale himself. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was overwhelming. In the span of just 3 weeks, Hale had modified Natalie's medication without a second signature, accessed her medical profile in the middle of the night, failed to disclose the new compound to the prison's psychiatric board, and now, Madame Carl was directly tied to a drug that killed her. When confronted, Hale refused to speak without a lawyer. He didn't deny the prescription, he didn't argue the dose, he didn't offer an explanation. But his silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Caleb Dorsey was also under fire, for weeks. He had maintained that he only did what was routine, that he never touched the cameras, that he followed protocol. But that lie didn't hold for long. Investigators retrieved a forgotten archive, a rarely used server backup from an old surveillance unit that had been scheduled for decommissioning. In it, they found one clip grainy, black and white, time-stamped at 1:47 a.m., 13 days before Natalie's death. The footage wasn't from her cell, it was from the hallway. A fixed-angle camera pointed at the electrical cabinet just outside the solitary wing. The footage showed Caleb Dorsey unlocking the panel, disconnecting a power source, plugging in a bypass cord, and then watching a light go off on the monitoring screen. He stood there, waiting, checking his watch. Then he walked toward Natalie's cell. That was it. No sound, no violence, no screaming. But it was enough. Dorsey was arrested on charges of evidence tampering, abuse of power, and custodial sexual assault. Hale followed 2 days later charged with reckless endangerment, unauthorized medical alteration, and second-degree murder, all. The indictment was swift, but justice was slow. During the pretrial hearing, Hale's attorney argued that the digitalis was part of an experimental treatment protocol and that Natalie's death was a tragic reaction to a complex psychiatric condition. Dorsey claimed he was following Hale's orders, assisting with psychiatric stabilization. No jury bought it. Not after the footage. Not after the pregnancy. Not after Natalie's own haunting words. Every night, I dream that someone's touching me. Oh my God! She hadn't been dreaming. She had been drugged, assaulted, poisoned, and silenced. But not completely. Because the evidence she never got to speak finally screamed loud enough. By the time the indictments were filed, the name Natalie Rivers had already become national news. News anchors called it the most disturbing prison scandal in over a decade. True crime podcasts exploded with speculation. Hashtags flooded social media, and every single headline came back to the same 3 impossible words. Pregnant, death row, murdered. The state scrambled to respond. The warden at St. Eloria was placed on administrative leave. The head of security resigned within days. 3 other staff members, including 2 nurses and a lower-ranking guard, were subpoenaed as witnesses. Governor Ethan Maddox, under mounting political pressure, issued a statement on live television. His tone was somber, measured, but unmistakably defensive. This is a tragedy, a failure of oversight. We are conducting a full review of St. Eloria and all correctional psychiatric protocols across the state. Let me be clear, any abuse of power will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But for many, the damage was already done. Civil rights groups called for independent audits of all death row units nationwide. The ACLU filed a federal motion demanding reform of solitary confinement policies. Women's advocacy organizations held candlelight vigils outside the prison gates, holding photos of Natalie, calling her the voice of the voiceless. Her name became a symbol, and her story a rallying cry. Behind the scenes, a legal storm was brewing. Natalie's family, though small and previously silent, hired a private attorney. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state, citing gross negligence, systemic abuse, and deliberate cover-up. The case made it all the way to federal court. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance tampering, unauthorized medication, a failure to investigate pregnancy, and worst of all, a culture of silence. During the hearings, a former staff psychologist came forward. Her testimony shocked the courtroom. She had filed a concern about Natalie's treatment 6 months before the death. Not a formal complaint, just a flagged observation that Natalie appeared overly sedated and disconnected from linear reality. That note was ignored, filed, buried. And when asked why she hadn't pushed harder, the psychologist looked down and simply said, "'Cause in here, speaking up gets you fired." That line echoed across the country. For years, the public had assumed that solitary confinement, especially on death row, was tightly controlled, regulated, watched, but the Natalie Rivers case shattered that illusion. She had been monitored by cameras, locked behind 3 steel doors, surrounded by protocols, and still she was violated, impregnated, poisoned, and erased. The system didn't just fail her, it enabled it. The civil case ended in a settlement. The amount was sealed, but insiders claimed it was north of $5 million. Money the family said would be used to create a legal fund for other female inmates abused while in custody. But not everyone was satisfied. Protesters marched outside the courthouse, demanding criminal charges against prison leadership. Whistleblowers within other facilities began coming forward with similar stories: ignored complaints, late-night incidents, strange medication logs. The Department of Corrections launched an emergency task force. Natalie's face, once unknown to the public, now stared back from magazine covers and social justice campaigns. But perhaps the most haunting moment came during the final sentencing hearing. When Dr. Warren Hale was given the chance to speak before sentencing, he declined. No apology, no admission, just silence. But the judge didn't stay silent. This court recognizes the irreparable harm caused not just to one woman, but to the credibility of the very system that was supposed to hold her accountable. You took advantage of a powerless human being, and you did it from a place of trust. Hale was sentenced to 45 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Caleb Dorsey received a life sentence for aggravated custodial assault and conspiracy to commit murder. Mom? Yo. The courtroom was quiet. But outside, the world had changed. Months passed. The trials were over. The prison staff had been reshuffled. New protocols were quietly introduced across multiple facilities. Cameras were upgraded. Psychiatric evaluations became stricter. And slowly, the story of Natalie Rivers began to fade from the front pages. But it never really went away. Because Natalie had left something behind. It was discovered during an audit of inmate personal effects, a brown envelope buried at the bottom of a sealed property box, marked simply to be mailed upon release. Of course, that day never came. The envelope contained a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice, no date, no recipient, just her handwriting. It wasn't long, it wasn't poetic, but it was real. And it was the only time Natalie Rivers ever truly spoke for herself. "I don't know what's happening to me. I feel disconnected. Like I wake up already tired. Sometimes I dream I'm not alone, but when I open my eyes, I forget the details. I try to focus, but the days melt together. It's hard to think, hard to trust what I remember. I'm not sure if I'm losing my mind or if someone is doing something to me. Either way, if something happens to me, it's not by choice. Please believe that. Please don't let it end like this. Oh my God." The letter was never sent. It sat in a drawer, unnoticed, unread, while she deteriorated in silence, while they drugged her, violated her, used her body without her consent. By the time anyone read her words, she was already gone. But the letter mattered. It mattered because it was the only thing that hadn't been manipulated. It wasn't a surveillance file. It wasn't a court record. It wasn't a headline. It was her, raw, vague, broken, and still trying to reach someone on the outside. The journalist who broke the story read the letter aloud on a national broadcast. Viewers wept, others raged, but all who listened understood one thing: Natalie knew something was wrong. And that knowledge, that instinct, was all she had left to fight with. She didn't get to live. She didn't get justice in time. She didn't get to hold her child or tell her story in her own words. But she was believed. In the end, that mattered. Because Natalie Rivers didn't die in vain. Her death sparked change. Her name became law, and the letter she never mailed became a warning one that every prison, every guard, every doctor would now be forced to remember. We tell her story not to reopen wounds, but to keep her voice alive, to remind people that behind every locked door is still a human being. And if this is your first time here, subscribe for more stories like this. Because sometimes the only justice left is to tell the truth.